A simple government proposal to raise the minimum wage for people under 21 to the rate that people 21 and over currently receive. It's a difference of £2.21 an hour, which if you're on £10 an hour, as 18 to 28-year-olds on minimum wage currently are, it makes quite a difference over the course of a whole shift. And we're not at our best when I just come on the radio and say, well, what do you think about that? But equally, some days it is a question you can answer more or less immediately. I wonder what are you thinking about now? So I say to you, should young people in the workplace get paid the same as older people? Should everybody doing the same job get paid the same wage, or is there a case for paying 18 to 20-year-olds less than a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old? Just because the arguments that are trotted out by wealth or business owners, and of course they're not the same thing, plenty of business owners are far from wealthy, but they are, if you like, in charge of the capital. Just because the same arguments are trotted out all the time by largely the same people doesn't mean that they're always wrong. You'll remember when they introduced minimum wage, everybody was about to go bankrupt. When they, every single time that governments tried to do something to improve the lot of the average worker, there is uproar across the print media because they have all got tame think tanks in their back pocket who will jump up and down to complain. Business can't possibly afford that. But it doesn't mean that it's always false, any more than it's clearly not always true. Minimum wage introductions, minimum wage legislation has not brought about the commercial Armageddon that was predicted by all the people who are currently complaining about plans to raise the minimum wage for 18, 19 and 20-year-olds. Am I making sense? Do you see what I mean? Just that. It may be true that this would be a bad thing to do. I don't want to conduct the phone-in from the perspective of the workers up the workers and bosses down with the bosses. What you want to happen is for the relatively high numbers of young people who can't currently get work or who aren't in work to find it easier to get work. And I can understand why. I think I can understand why. Can I understand why? Increasing their minimum wage would make it less likely for them to find the jobs that are currently going to the people who are not getting paid the minimum wage. Do you see what I mean? You see why it's it could be a little bit trickier than first impressions allow. But when I ask you that question, should the youngest members of the workforce get paid the same as everybody else, what do you immediately think of? What story, what period of your life, what moment are you immediately thinking of? When you compare the job you did as a school leaver or perhaps still as a student to what the job being done by older colleagues was. See, I'm going to come up with a strong opinion by 10:15, but at the moment I haven't actually got one. Because, well, so there was this bloke, right, when I worked in retail, my last job in retail, I had several, and he was obsessed with the fact, genuinely obsessed, to the point that he would show me his payslip every month. He was obsessed with the fact that his taxes were paying for my university education. And he hadn't gone to university. And he felt it was hideously wrong that he should be paying for me, who was already from a more privileged background than him, to be going to university to enhance my employment prospects moving forward. And I don't know if you had many moments like this when you were young, but it did actually prompt me to rethink my politics a little bit. I know I grew up in a very different world from the one that 19-year-olds inhabit today. My university education was more or less free. I owed some money. I had some loans for maintenance and things like that, but nothing for tuition or anything like that. A different world, almost unrecognisable to people aged 19, 20 listening to this today. But that's what it was like for us. That's what it's still like for a lot of people in other countries. And if you were older than me, you didn't even have to borrow money. There wasn't even a student loan system for your maintenance. That would be provided by the local education authority after some rough means testing on your parents' income. But I remember this bloke. I remember his name. I remember his jewellery. He used to wear big, clunky bling. He was one of the first people I encountered, big signet rings. So Andy Hughes was talking to us, not that kind of signet ring, but like sovereign rings, working in a very posh menswear shop. And he cut a certain dash. He had a certain elan. And he was routinely one of the highest earners when it came to commission. But guess who else was? Me. And I got paid an hourly rate that was much less than his because I was 19 and he was 50. And at the time, I thought that was probably unfair. The political change that he brought about in me was not the nothing to do with the fact that we were paid differently. It was the fact because I thought he kind of had a point when it came to the tuition fees. I shouldn't go, I've got to stop doing this, Keith. Someone should be in charge of this programme. I can't go off on a tangent about tuition fees and class and privilege and background. It's got absolutely nothing to do, oh Lord, I'm doing the weave. It's got absolutely nothing to do with the conversations that I want to have. But you know how my brain works. I'm suddenly more interested in that than I am in that. So we'll park that for another day. But I'm thinking of him, and I wonder who you're thinking of. What moment in your life are you thinking of now when you address the question of whether or not an 18-year-old, 19, 20-year-old in the workforce should get paid the same as the 50-year-old, never mind the 25-year-old or the 22-year-old? That's the phone in, so you can book your place on the board now, 0345 60 60973, and we can all come at that. You don't need to be in the correct demographic or a business owner or any of those things. You can come at it as a moral... So we'll start at 10:10 with a moral question. Morally, should a 19-year-old get paid the same as a 50-year-old? 0345 60 60973. If, of course, the 50-year-old is still unfortunate enough to be on the minimum wage. And then you sort of come at it slightly differently and you think about it in terms of productivity. And I suspect that the more young and vigorous you are, then in many jobs that receive the minimum wage, the more young and vigorous you are, the more productive you will be, and therefore the more money you're making for your company. But then in the service sector and in retail, where most minimum wage jobs will be, there are softer skills that are not measurable solely by sales and how much money you take over the till. There's always a colleague, isn't there, to whom you refer the complaints or the difficult customer, and that colleague will have a lot more experience and a lot more nous, if you like, and knowledge on how to deal with certain situations. But now you're thinking of a 19-year-old that you worked with 30 years ago who was like Kofi Annan. They were so good at diplomacy and negotiations. And so why should they get paid less than the miserable old git over there who spends his entire shift waiting for counting the minutes until his next tea break? And then you come to this thing that I hope doesn't happen to me. This thing that you hope doesn't happen to me. I hope, you may not care one way or the other, but I think this is a terrible time to be young. If you make a list of things that you were frightened of when you were 16, let's say, if you're of a certain age, you've got nuclear war, right? Older than me, really. I don't think we were frightened about nuclear war, just at the back end of it. What about now? Now you're frightened of everything. You're frightened of the fact that the world is being run by climate change deniers. The sea levels are rising. Humanity is under threat. AI is coming for all the jobs that you could reasonably have developed an ambition to do 10 years ago. Having this conversation last night, I had a little mini reunion with some of my my old Daily Express colleagues. It's 25 years since I'd seen some of them last night. And AI was a major topic of conversation, just still... almost gobsmacked at the speed with which it's coming for everything. You know, people who were making a living writing things being replaced by AI, photographers being replaced by AI. And we're in our 50s. Imagine being 16 today and being 10, 6 years ago and making a list of the jobs that you quite fancy doing and then just slowly crossing them off one by one as they became jobs, barristers, as they became jobs that would be replaced by AI. So it's, I think, and I hope I'm wrong, I've got young people and they're... I've got young people, I've got children, and they're on a fairly even keel. I'm not suggesting everyone's walking around with big rain clouds over their heads, but I'd rather be 16 in 1988 than be 16 in 2026, I think, in terms of things that I'm frightened of in the future. And I have to hold that thought in my head, because otherwise I do become a little bit, can we say gittish? I become a little bit gittish. I become a little bit like my old colleague who just sort of thought that I was less than him because I was young. No matter how much money I put over the till, no matter how good I was at the job, no matter how quick I learned the skills of marking with chalk a suit so that we could get the trousers shortened or the sleeves adjusted, or take in the side seams or let out the back seam on the trousers. He just felt that he should be paid more than me because he was a grown-up and I was a kid. And when I started looking at this story earlier this morning, I kind of found myself feeling something similar to that. There should just be a gradation. There's something... Is it dishonourable, disrespectful to pay a 40-year-old man what an 18-year-old gets? It can feel very wrong to me, that. But why? Because an 18-year-old is an adult. An 18-year-old is a taxpayer. An 18-year-old has agency, has autonomy. An 18-year-old can be making just as big a contribution to a company as a 50-year-old. If you're going to be rewarding experience, then you're not going to be talking about older people on the minimum wage. You're rewarding experience by increasing their wage above the bottom threshold, above the basement level of the minimum wage. So I don't think that quite works as an answer. And I don't know if this is true today, but back in the day, there was a sense that you'd be better off hiring a thrusting young undergraduate to do you a summer holiday job than perhaps a 30-year-old person who was not as motivated or indeed as hungry. That's a generalisation, I know, but it's what a former manager in menswear said to me once. So the moral question is it fair to pay a younger person less than an older person simply because of their age? They're doing an identical job. 0345 60 Then if you're a boss, I want to know what you would do. Just to tell me straight up whether or not an increase in minimum wage will make you less likely to hire a 20-year-old who in a year will become a 21-year-old to whom you have to pay the higher rate anyway. Because I'm struggling. That's why I began by saying they can't always be wrong when they claim they can't afford it. Business owners can't. Do you remember that brilliant question that a texter sent in when we were talking to somebody about, I think, pub taxes or something, and he was explaining how he was going to have to shut one of his venues if things didn't improve. And you sent me a text saying, ask him what he drives. So I asked him what he drove, and it was like a 70 grand car. And suddenly the idea that he can't afford to pay 4 people minimum wage anymore just fell apart in a way like a cheap suit. But I've never really run a business, so maybe there are considerations there that I don't fully understand. But they are queuing up today to tell me, or they are queuing up to tell the media, that if they have to pay a 20-year-old £12.21 an hour instead of £10 an hour, then they can't afford to hire the 20-year-old, who will become a 21-year-old in about, well, possibly in a week's time, but in at least a year's time, at the most a year's time, and then they will have to pay them £12.21. I don't know whether it happens to you, but you spend some time contemplating a topic and you think it's quite complex, and you realise that perhaps it isn't. Maybe I'm being too generous. This is just about trying to get away with paying people as little as possible so you can keep more of it for yourself, isn't it? So you see the front page of the Times, and I'm sorry that I'm susceptible to this still, having spent my entire life or most of my working life, trying to point out how easily manipulated we all are. Oh yeah, well, won't somebody think of the bosses? Why shouldn't I pay a 19-year-old £10 an hour? £10 an hour to wash dishes or pick potatoes or serve drinks? Because if I had to pay them £2.21 an hour, that's £2.21 less that I'd be able to keep. And if you've got 10 employees, that's £22.10 an hour that I'd be able to keep. So of course I'm going to hire a younger person because I get to keep the money otherwise. And then you dress it up as, oh, my business won't survive. My business won't survive if I have to pay people £12.21 an hour. If your business won't survive, if you have to pay people £12.21 an hour, then as a great believer in capitalism and free market economics, you should recognise that your business is unviable. I find it, of all the things I find extraordinary, and you know I find a lot of things extraordinary, and you know that by the extraordinary amount of times I use the word extraordinary. But of all the things I find extraordinary, it is the idea of wages paid by companies that make millions of pounds, let's say supermarkets, being topped up by universal credit because they're not paying enough to their staff for their staff to have a living wage. The percentage of people on universal credit who are in full-time work, it's extraordinary. And yet a lot of them will be working for employers that are shifting dividends to their shareholders at a rate of knots. And now you're supposed to tell me to think of the small business person. I haven't got shareholders, it's just me. If you're seriously telling me that you can't afford to pay that person £12.21 an hour, you have to pay them £10. What are you going to do when they turn 21? Sack them? Does that happen? Actually, that's a proper question. 0345 6060 973. Do you get sacked from a job when you are 20 years and 364 days old because you're working for an Ebenezer Scrooge who begrudges you the £2.21 that they'd have to pay you the next day? I hate it when this happens, but I also love it. I hate it when I start off in good faith thinking that a story is nuanced and complicated and not part of the sort of Wolfie Smith school of politics, wealth versus labour, capital versus worker. And then, I don't know why, it takes a moment, a couple of calls for my thoughts to crystallise, and I can't believe we're sitting here in 2026 having a conversation about whether businesses should be required to pay 20-year-old adults £12.21 an hour as a basic minimum. £12.21 an hour as a basic minimum. How gaslit and groomed have we been as a country that this is not only a debate, but also a debate that's reached the front page of the Times with reports that a Labour government, the government of Angela Rayner, well, not for now, I grant you, but not long ago and soon, is apparently poised to reverse this? To say, no, carry on paying the kids 10 quid an hour because won't somebody think of the business people who are going to lose £2.21 an hour per... Come on. This is a lot simpler than I thought, right?